Genesis 4:14. We have heard about four people so far after creation: Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. Why was Cain worried about being killed by others? Were there other people alive on earth? That's question number one. Question number two, where did Cain get his wife? Was she his sister or niece?
God created Adam and Eve with two purposes, not one. The first purpose was to have fellowship with God, voluntarily worshiping for who he is, not what he does for them. But remember that their second purpose was to populate the earth. And so as soon as they leave the garden, they start to have children. Now, if you'll go to Genesis chapter 5, and specifically you want to go to verse 4, you'll notice it says there that Adam lived 830 years, 930 years total, but that he had many other sons and daughters. Now, Cain married his sister. There was nothing wrong with that. There was no law against it. It was not immoral, unethical, or bad in any way whatsoever, because you have to remember that human beings were nearly perfect after the sin occurred in the garden, and that the laws of decays, both in physical and natural systems, although they had begun, were still having very little effect. That is to say that the law of decay is like a snowball going downhill. Initially, the decay of genetic information was very small. Today, unfortunately, the law of decay in our genetic material called genetic entropy, we are adding about 60 new mutations, about 60 new errors every generation at this point. But initially it would have been one per generation, maybe two per generation. And so marrying close relatives was not a problem. And God only has one law for marriage, and that's one woman, one man united for a lifetime. However, at the time of Moses, which is 2,500 years after creation, God, knowing that because of the continuing decay of genetic information, will eventually then produce genetic diseases if close relatives continue to marry, through Moses, he declares that you can no longer marry your close relatives. You're no longer to marry your sisters. You're no longer to marry your first cousins. And this was not a sin law. It was a health law to prevent genetic disease in the population. After all, remember that Abraham married his half-sister by blood, but it was not an issue. It was not a problem. And Abraham is living as a young man about the time of Job. He predates Moses by 300, 400 years. But by the time of Moses, this has become a problem medically. And this is when God stops it. And the law against incest is not a sin law, it's a health law.
Thank you so much for that. There's a question from a lady called Claire. Said, hello, I often wonder why it is that in the beginning of Genesis, it seems that people didn't start to have children until they were what we would consider as being old. For example, when Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Canaan. Then after the flood, they started having children at an age we would consider normal today. Could it be that because they lived for hundreds of years and the living conditions of the world before the flood were so good, they aged so slowly that they didn't reach puberty for many years? Presumably, Adam and Eve were created genetically perfect. After the fall, mankind slowly devolved, genetically speaking.
Well, actually, she's repeating a little bit of what I just said in the last answer. However, it's a mixture of what you said. Now, for instance, I produced a TV program, DVD available with Revelation on how people live to be 900 years old. And I shared 19 medical scientific reasons which, taken in combination, would have allowed that. But you have to remember that Adam and Eve were not created as babies. They were not created as toddlers or as children. They were created as juveniles at the age of puberty. And remember that their second purpose was to procreate, to fill the earth. Now, that means that Eve would have become pregnant immediately after having left the garden. And so the first children were born to Adam and Eve immediately. And when it says in chapter 5 that Adam had many other sons and daughters, just imagine for a moment, uh, with the lifespan of hundreds of years, Adam and Eve could have had hundreds of children. Now, Seth is the third named son, but that does not necessarily mean that he is the third son. He is simply the son of promise. He is the son to replace Abel, who was slain by Cain. But he is not necessarily the third son. He's just the third one named. Now, when it comes to the children of Adam and Eve, of course, they were born and they were babies and they did grow up and they did have these long, long lifespans. And even Shem would live 500 years after the flood to the age of 600. Now, that would indicate that while Adam and Eve started to have children immediately, because they're already reproducing adults, that their children and their lifespan is just like ours, only stretched out over a longer period of time, so that they would have experienced life as we do, only stretched out over a much longer period of time. So that for the children of Adam and Eve, puberty occurred at a much later stage in life. And then after the flood, as human life expands, then start to diminish, again, the age of puberty would get less and less because the age of death was less and less.
Thank you.
And so that there is definitely a direct correlation there.